Believe the science, they tell me. Okay, what about the scientists? Different story, right? Believe the science, believe the science. That's the mantra that we've heard repeatedly over the last few years, especially since the advent of COVID. You know, a very interesting thing happened and is recently happening in the last few days, and that is that there is a big question about how much trust and faith we should put in scientists themselves. Let me frame it up for you if you're not aware. RFK Jr. has entered the presidential race as a Democrat. He's going to go against Joe Biden for the nomination. Now, this is very interesting because RFK Jr. has heretofore been subject to a lot of cancel culture based on his conviction that vaccines are dangerous. Now, it's not the purpose of this video to discuss whether or not vaccines are dangerous. I'm sure you have your opinion as well as I have mine. But YouTube has gone out of its way to suppress some of the beliefs and opinions that RFK Jr. has related to vaccines. I'll give you a point in case. He recently went on the Jordan Peterson show, which is a very large podcast on YouTube. And for the very first time, YouTube completely deleted Peterson's episode. Now, YouTube does this all the time, but not necessarily to Jordan Peterson. This has never happened before. In fact, interestingly, even in the midst of the conversation, Jordan Peterson said they've never deleted my videos. And then sure enough, they ended up deleting that video because RFK Jr. was on there. Well, then RFK Jr. goes on the Joe Rogan podcast, and that is not on YouTube. It's on Spotify, and it happens to be the biggest podcast in the entire world. Joe Rogan gets massive bonkers numbers. And as soon as RFK Jr. goes on the Rogan show, all of a sudden, as you might expect, some of the representatives of big science, big pharma, etc., begin to kick back at Rogan and RFK. This is going to be very interesting to see how this all pans out in the near future with RFK as a possible Democratic nominee. Can you even imagine what would happen? And so Rogan threw out the idea of like, look, scientists, if you disagree with RFK on vaccines, fine, come on my channel and you can have a debate. In fact, there's this guy called Peter Hotz, I believe that's how you pronounce his name. He is one who commented very snarkily against RFK Jr. in the Joe Rogan show. And Rogan said, look, man, I'll throw out $100,000 to your favorite charity. You can come on and you can debate RFK Jr. on the facts. Well, some of us think that that would be a very interesting episode, and I would love to see that happen. But it definitely brings into my mind the question of believe the science versus believe the scientists. Okay, so let's think a little bit about science. Well, science is supposed to be exact. It's supposed to be unchallengeable. It's supposed to be authoritative. It's supposed to be real truth. In fact, sometimes science is posited as an antithesis to religion. You'll have certain people that say they believe in God. Certainly, you're looking at one of them right now. I'm a Christian theist. I'm a Christian pastor even. There will be others who will tell you, and they'll boldly do so, that they don't believe in God. They believe in science, as though science is a religion in its own right. Well, what do you mean by that? I'd like to ask a few questions, if you don't mind, and I'm not trying to be rude, but when you talk about the fact that you believe in science, are you telling me that you believe in the conclusions of science, or are you telling me that you believe in the process of science? And again, I think those are two different things. So suppose you say you believe in the conclusions related to science. Well, the problem with saying something like that is it's a lot like getting on a moving bus. Every time you try to get on, the bus moves a little bit, and certainly when you try to get off, that's equally difficult. Now, suppose you say you believe in the conclusions of science, right? Okay, well, which conclusions? Because science seems to change every day. We could talk about the geocentric theory of the universe versus the heliocentric theory of the universe versus Einsteinian relativity. That has changed. At one time, what was considered the science no longer was the science anymore, and then it changed again after that. Think about how many times they've told you that butter is good, now it's not good, wine is good, now it's not good. Science is changing all the time. In fact, you take any given scientific textbook and 100 years later, it will be hopelessly obsolete, if not entirely laughable. So which conclusions of science do you mean? The current ones Well, then wait 10 years and you'll find yourself to be woefully lost. Now, if you tell me that you believe in the process of science, then maybe we're onto something here, because I think science in general is a rather good process as long as it's held to stridently. So let's think about the process of science here for just a moment. Science is testing a hypothesis. What is a hypothesis? Well, it's kind of an educated guess as to what you think is going to happen. But you don't just go by your feels or by your emotions or by what you think is guiding you internally. You go by a testable process. And that's where that hypothesis is put up against the hard reality of testable, observable observation and rigorous analysis. In fact, whatever you think emotionally about your own hypothesis, you have to accept the observable, repeatable conclusions when you subject it to that kind of rigor. And this is very key here, that science is not done unless the conclusion is repeatable under various circumstances, right? So supposing you set up the scientific process correctly, if you can't get the same result again tomorrow that you had today, or next week that you had tomorrow, then your hypothesis really is in doubt. And so what happens then is you have to revise your process. And this is why science always seems to be kind of on the move. There is no fixed set of conclusions, though the process itself might be reliable. So we might say it's something like this, to generalize here, that while science is an objective process, scientists themselves are subjective. And that is exactly where we have the right to say, hey, I'll believe the science, but I do have the right, every right, to question the scientists. And that's where guys like Peter Hotez and certainly Anthony Fauci should be subject to extreme rigor and questioning. And that's why I'd like to see this debate actually take place. Hey, if RFK Jr. is so easy to disprove, then by all means come on the Joe Rogan podcast and show us exactly why. So what I'd like to do right now is take you through 7 questions that I would like to ask of any scientist, because at the end of the day, while the process of science may be reliable, I don't think scientists should be believed without question. In fact, I would suggest that we should very seriously question the scientists that we say we trust. Let me throw out several questions. First of all, Mr. Scientist, what are your presuppositions? In other words, what is your worldview? What's the basic construct of reality that you think you're working on? Okay? And we should be honest about that from the very get-go. I would call myself a Christian, a theist. Are you an atheist? Does that mean you're working from a philosophical worldview in which the possibility of God is entirely excluded, even from the word go? Are you an atheist? Are you agnostic? Do you pull up lame when it comes to the question of whether or not there might be a God who actually ordained and constructed the world that we live in today? I find that to be relevant, and I'd like to ask you what worldview you're coming from. Are you an idealist? Are you postmodern? Do you believe that there is any such thing as truth or any meta-narrative that's holding history together? You know, one of the problems with science walks around with a big white jacket and it pretends that it's completely objective. In fact, what science does quite a bit is fall prey to the logical fallacy called argumentum ad verecundium. Now, I know that's kind of a big Latin word there, but it's basically the fallacy related to authority. Just because an authority tells you something is true, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's true. I think all philosophers have recognized that the fallacy of authority is a pretty common one. In fact, you hear it all the time in the world of science. For instance, even something as simple as 4 out of 5 dentists recommend Crest for your toothpaste. Okay, well, why doesn't the other guy, and why should I believe the first 4? All right, so just because science talks about itself in a very high and esteemed way doesn't necessarily mean that we are to believe all of the things that they posit. In fact, very often we should come at them rather skeptically. Science always talks about leading scientists or expert scientists or some of the most revered scientists of all. And certainly we heard all kinds of language like that during the time of COVID. We heard all about what science has already concluded. Interesting how fast it was that they reached the conclusions. Interesting how vast was their unanimity that they claimed to have. Later on, here we are several years later, we come to realize that actually there was quite a bit of concern with the narrative as it was coming out. So it turns out that actually worldview does matter. And so I would say, first of all, question the worldview of the scientists that tell you should believe what they think you ought to believe. Second question, who's funding you and who's paying you? Is that relevant? I think it is. Okay, so you've got your white lab coat, and there's your microscope, and there's your telescope over here, and here's your beakers, and whatever else you have. But somebody's paying for this. Who is it, and why are they paying for it? Now, here's the big ugly secret that most science is funded from three sources. You've got universities, of course, with their major endowments, but do you trust the universities? Some of them, yes. Some of them, maybe not. A lot of science is funded by governments. Well, okay, so how much do you trust your government these days? And then a lot of them are funded by like private grants or corporations because they want to get something done. So people like Bill Gates are out there funding lots of studies and lots of scientific endeavors. But then again, I have to question, why should I believe the results of your study if I know that there's somebody suspect that's actually funding the entire thing? Now, let me just throw out a caveat here because I'm not entirely a conspiracy theorist, although obviously I have some doubts about some of the things that big science has been telling us lately. My caveat is this: I believe in a world that actually functions, and that's because I am a Christian. So I believe, and this is my presupposition here, that God created the world, and he created the world in such a way that it is largely consistent with the rules of the physics in which God imposed in the structure that he has made. So I believe airplanes fly, for instance, because the rules of aerodynamics are very consistent. I believe in measuring tapes, and I believe in the laws of physics and the laws of thermodynamics and things like this. I believe for the most part that God's universe is entirely consistent, very consistent, and that's why science usually works, at least the process thereof. But when money comes into it, then all of a sudden my conspiracy side of my brain kind of begins to twitch a little bit, and I get that little twitch in my eye. That's the tell that all of a sudden I'm getting a little bit skeptical. The more money that's poured into it from the more dubious of source, the less credible I think that scientific research is. And so when it comes to some of the major questions that we're talking about lately, I do think the funding of the research and where it comes from certainly should be questioned. Third, I want to know, what are your unchallengeable dogmas? Now, I use the word dogma on purpose because I think a lot of us are far more religious than we like to admit. Even those scientists that would say that they come from an atheistic worldview, they begin to start talking a lot like religionists when they posit for you some of their unchallengeable dogmas, their underlying doctrines that they believe in, those things that are unquestionable and unchallengeable according to their worldview. Let me throw out a couple of examples here. How about racism? Now, no scientist would like to raise their hand and say, yes, I'm a racist. But isn't it true that there are certain conclusions, and I'm not going to be too specific on exactly what conclusions I'm talking about here in this video, I'll let your imagination run wild, but isn't it true that there are certain conclusions that are ruled out a priori? They cannot be the case. In fact, if you were to do a major university study and you came with certain conclusions as over against others, let's say in the area of sociology or anthropology or politics, then those conclusions would be unacceptable, and that study would be rejected and it would never get published. Same thing too with gender ideology or LGBTQ issues or even equity, that Marxist doctrine, which rises to the level of dogma, which in some universities is absolutely unchallengeable. And so what happens is in these enterprises that they kind of come off as though they're entirely objective. What you find if you scratch a little bit below the surface is that even the hard science and scientists have their unchallengeable dogmas and doctrines that they would never dare go against. Otherwise, they would risk their own scientific reputation. They would never get published, and they'd never get the peer review support that they need in order to advance their careers. If you don't believe me on that, can I please commend to you a former researcher by the name of Deborah Soh, S-O-H. She was an expert in the brain and human sexuality, and she was doing some pretty hard science in her previous career as a researcher related to sex and gender. All of a sudden, though, what she found is that her conclusions, the conclusions of her studies, did not support the narrative that the universities wanted to receive. They wanted their experiments to come back in certain ways, and Deborah So found that this simply was not happening when she was doing the process rigorously. And so all of a sudden she found herself subject to a vast amount of cancel culture. I do commend her podcast to you. I believe it is called Wrong Think or something like that. She's kind of rebranded her podcast a couple times, but give her a follow on Twitter. She's a very interesting person. She ended up moving from the hard sciences into journalism because she realized that if she was going to be consistent with the findings of her studies, that she was going to be entirely excommunicated from the scientific community. And that is because she was finding things that did not support the unchallengeable dogmas of the science, that unchallengeable science that seems to be so ubiquitous. Fourth, Mr. Scientist, can I ask, can I dare? Is it right? Is it okay? Is it permissible for me to ask some questions? How far are you willing to go to be right? Now, this is where the human element really gets into the process itself and why even the process of science is subject to quite a bit of error. See, human beings, we get invested. We get invested in our ideas. We get invested in our projects, heavily invested in our projects. And we want our projects to succeed, all things being considered. And so whenever a scientist forms a particular hypothesis, there's a little part of the heart that cheers it on, that wants it to be true. After all, you've done all of this work to get this funding. You've done all of this work to set up the experiments. And if it turns out that your hypothesis is incorrect, then it would seem to be all for naught. And so sometimes there are certain scientists that are willing to fudge the data just a little bit, or to skew the summary, or to hide any inconsistent counter evidence. I think if we're completely honest, 3 years out from COVID now, we can look back on some of the things that we were to believe the science turned out to be not true. I'll let you think about that just for yourself for a few moments, but there are certain things related to social distancing and some of the precautions that we were urged to take. Actually, interestingly enough, Fauci said we were to do this and then not do this and then do it again and then double do it. I think you could probably pick up on some of the things that I'm hinting here. It's interesting, though, how even scientists with their white lab coats are willing to eventually fudge and smear and smudge and highlight and rewrite the data just a little bit in order to get the results that they were hoping for all along. How far are you willing to go to get the result that you wanted? Why should I believe that you are objective? And that leads me to my next question, the fifth question. Who stands to gain if your project ends up being successful? This goes back to the dollar signs, my friends. This goes back to the question of funding. Who's going to hit the bank lever if your project is entirely successful? Is it going to be big pharma? Is this going to be a product that you can sell? Is it going to be a product that you can control? Is it going to be a product that you can require? If so, then the dollar signs are going to be rich. The dollar signs are going to come at you heavy and often. Is it going to be the military-industrial complex? Does your project lean into war or the machinations of warmongering? Is big tech, does big tech stand to gain? Well, that's a question too. Who's going to be able to make a profit off of a successful research project has to be considered, and it has to be asked, especially of those who are telling us that we must believe the science. Sixth, what are you willing to do to your intellectual opponents? That gets a little awkward, doesn't it? Because sometimes what happens is that science sets itself up into rivalries of various camps. There's one camp that pushes this hypothesis. There's another that says, no way, we think it's that. And these end up being something like intellectual opponents in the race to find out what is actually true. Unfortunately, the human element tends to get into it quite significantly here again, because one successful study will often work hard to suppress the results of another study that's actually counterintuitive, which comes to different results. And so all of a sudden, cancel culture becomes a part of the game. Reputations are besmirched, and so on and so forth. Again, I submit to you the entire debacle of COVID to you if you're not aware that there were certain other viewpoints that were entirely ruled out, canceled, denied, erased, memory hold, then maybe you weren't keeping up as well as you thought you were. Seventh, and this again goes to the human element of science, what are your deepest motivations? Now, scientists are human beings like everybody else, okay? They have motivations. Why are you doing this? Are you doing this for profit? Some people are, no question about that. They want to turn a profit by making a product that's ultimately marketable. Other scientists, they just want to be published. And quite honestly, I can relate to that. I have a desire to publish and to write things that people read. A lot of scientists are motivated by peer-reviewed studies and publications. In my field, in theology, everybody wants to go to the ETS conference, the Evangelical Theological Society, and get their paper published. That's a big thing. I get it. Peer acceptance is another one. Pride, progress. Maybe they really do care about whether or not human beings are advancing in this world. But those 5 P's, profit, publication, peer acceptance, pride, and progress, man, I'll tell you what, they are undeniably part of the scientific endeavor, and anybody who tells you it's not is definitely lying to you. So what are we to conclude about all of this? Well, first of all, a couple things here. All scientists are human beings, and therefore, as subjective as they are, their deepest motivation should be questioned. That brings me to number 2, that is that all people are deeply flawed. We're sinners, and we sin often. We mess up a lot. And we bring our desires and our hoped aspirations and all these things into the scientific process. And that means that, lastly, motivations are mixed at best. So I would say it is absolutely incumbent upon every thinking person not only to question the science, but to question the scientists as well, especially so. Thanks for checking into this YouTube channel. My name is Matthew Everhard. I'm the pastor here at Gospel Fellowship PCA. Come visit us in real life. Love you lots. Thanks for checking in, and we'll talk to you later.